Reactive Training Systems.
Hey guys, I got an interesting episode for the podcast this week. If you're familiar with Eric Helms, you have probably seen this already. This is a repost from an episode that I recorded with Eric and Greg Nuckols and Bryce Lewis shortly after the EPC this summer. And we're just basically reposting it here. I had an opportunity to sit down with these guys and talk about the weaknesses of the emerging strategies concept. If you've been listening to this for any length of time, you know basically what the emerging strategies concept is. And you also know that I feel like any kind of tool has these weaknesses, and it's better to know about them than not know about them, because if you don't know about them, then it's just a blind spot, which I'm pretty sure that I say that quite a bit. So I wanted to sit down with some other smart people and talk about perceived weaknesses in the idea, see if we can come up with something a little bit more concrete. And it actually turned into a really great discussion, and got Eric's permission to repost it here. So without any further introduction, I'll just go ahead and bring that content over to you guys.
What's going on, 3DMJers? I am here with three people after the EPC 2018, that's the European Powerlifting Conference. You probably have no idea who these gentlemen are. No, I'm just kidding. If you do, that's a travesty. This is Greg Nuckols, this is Bryce Lewis, and this is Mike Tuchscherer. These are probably three of the most respected people in powerlifting when it comes to programming, coaching, and actually being competitive athletes. So I have the pleasure today to have him here to talk about anecdotes and observations. We're going to be discussing some of the systematic approaches that Mike T uses, called emerging strategies, of looking at anecdotes and observations in a way that can be really useful towards programming. So once again, that's anecdotes and observations. That's AO, pronounced AO. Perfect. So first, Mike, do you think you could give us a high-level summary of what emerging strategies is?
Yes, it's a systematic way of going through the individualization process. So, I guess just to keep it as short as possible, in a normal training block, which we call development cycle, you would take one microcycle worth of training, which is usually a training week, and you repeat it over and over. So that's the same exercises, the same sets, the same reps, the same RPE. So you get small fluctuations in the load, but that's the only thing that changes from one week to the next. And you just monitor the athlete's results. As long as the results are going up, you keep doing what you're doing. When the results stop going up, then you go into what we call pivot block, which you can just think of as a deload. And then you go into a new development cycle that's fundamentally different exercises, different volumes, intensities, and so on. You learn a lot of things from it. You learn how long does it take an athlete to go from the start of the development cycle to this peak condition, which seems to be a fairly stable number.
With an individual?
Yeah, it's fairly stable to that individual. So if it's 6 exposures, then it's 6 exposures for the next block and the next block and the next block as well. So it's useful for timing. And over time, you also can develop a picture of what that athlete responds best to, which intensities get them the best results, which volumes get, volumes, intensities, exercises, things like that. And that's helped me a lot throughout the individualization process. But one reason why I'm excited to talk to you guys about it is, I always say that all ideas have weaknesses, and if you don't know what the weakness of an idea is, then it's just a blind spot. And if I'm a coach in the real world, then having a blind spot is going to be not a good thing. So right. I think I know what some of the weaknesses are to it, but at the same time, I'm always kind of wanting to know more about that.
Well, dude, first I just want to say I tremendously respect that you're like, hey, let me just on camera expose any potential holes in my system. You know? I think that's a true sign of someone who's trying to do right by their clients and use the collective intelligence of the lifting community to improve.
Well, I'll just ask you not to post it.
Right, yeah. So if you're seeing this, he came out looking better than he does in actuality, right? So So yeah, Bryce, we were talking a little bit. I wonder if you could share what you might think some of the potential blind spots might be in the system, if you think there are some.
Sure. Like when I kind of first heard about it, I was like, oh, this is different. I don't like it. And like I kind of threw up some natural resistances, but I think Mike has a ton of sound ideas here. Like number one is trying to find signal in the noise, and I think that's something that all good strength coaches are trying to do, trying to find out, okay, with everything going on, what are the things that are actually working for the athlete, and how can we measure those and kind of identify those things, because presumably we want to do more of those things and less of the things that don't work as time goes on. Of a few things, the one thing I'm curious about Mike's thoughts and your guys' thoughts too is, I remember you saying over the weekend that oftentimes you've got to ride out a certain configuration of a week for a few weeks before you can figure out what works or what doesn't. And if you're already waiting a few weeks to figure out what works or what doesn't, what's the difference between doing that and allowing for weekly variation before figuring out what's working and what isn't?
Well, my thinking is that you just would never know. If you have enough weekly variation, you would just never know which of the stimuli is causing the effect that you see.
Sure.
So something that I notice is you give this development cycle and you see it through to the end. There's usually one of three response types. Type 1, and all this stuff I learned from Derek Evely, who learned it from Bondarchuk, so, and it seems to hold for powerlifting as well. So the type 1 is just a steady increase in results throughout the development cycle. A type 2 has a dip in performance in the early stage, and then a steady increase from there. And then a type 3 is relatively stagnant performance throughout most of the development cycle until the very end, where you might get a dip, but there's a spike in performance. So it's really the type 3 that kind of throws a wrench into things. Because if everybody was a type 1, you could just look at like each exposure, right? Like I did 5s last week and I'm better this week, therefore 5s are good for me. But it's that type 3 response where you may be stagnant for 8 weeks and then have a spike at the very end that kind of throws a wrench into things.
Question for you guys, like, are there any physiological reasons why there would be such extreme different types to exposure to strength training?
So why would some people need a different number of exposures or even have a different pattern to how they progress? That I could speculate, but I wouldn't be confident in any of them. You know, I think that's one of the whole points of talking about anecdotes and observations. It's like, is it even worth speculating? Like, it might be if that actually might change your decision.
Yeah.
But I think we're so far from knowing all the different pieces that go into that I'm not sure it'd be useful. I don't know, what do you think, Greg?
No, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, Bryce, I was thinking I also had a natural resistance, and I think probably just for those of you who are following, to get an idea of probably why that natural resistance occurred is technically, if you're not modifying load, if it's just RPE, and if you're keeping the same sets and reps, it's not technically periodized within the mesocycle. Which, while none of us have the illusion that periodization is like the magic, amazing key that it could be, and we definitely understand that it has limitations, and Greg has written about them, to have a completely unperiodized plan, especially for elite level powerlifters, is counterintuitive. Now, that's not to say that I don't think emerging strategies isn't periodized, because you have multiple blocks that are different. Is that accurate?
Yes.
So, if anything, it's like a auto-regulated reactive block periodized model.
Yeah.
Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, I would say so. So the way that the block sequence works out is after you start to develop this picture of this works well for an athlete, say you take whatever it is that's most effective, and that's what you put immediately before the competition. What's second most effective? Well, that's what goes in the block before that. And you rarely find yourself trying to string together more than 2, maybe 3 blocks, because more than that, the unpredictability just kind of gets out of hand.
something always happens,
Right.
So you string together 2 or 3 of your most effective blocks, and that could be and is for the average powerlifter what you would see as a linear progression, like the intensity gets higher, because most powerlifters respond well to that, which is why that's, in my opinion, that's why that's common practice. But some don't. Some have negative reactions to high intensity and really positive reactions to something else. Well, if you have a negative reaction to high intensity, why would you do that before a competition? Well, you wouldn't, obviously, but my problem was I was never able to see that before I started looking at it in this way. I had an athlete for a number of years, and we would train, things are going great, and then we get close to the competition and things just kind of fizzle. Sometimes you get these little nagging injuries, and when we started doing this emerging strategies thing, I noticed it's like every time we touch high intensity, that's when it happens, so let's just not do that. And that worked great, but it presented some other problems, so it became this game of trying to find what's just the minimum amount of high intensity stuff we can do so that we know where your strength is at, and then we go into the meet and have actual good attempt selection. So it wasn't really a strength development thing, it was more of a tactical thing.
Right.
Just to clarify here real quick, if you were going through this process and you try a lower intensity approach, maybe auto-regulated, how did you tell that someone was making better progress? So were they hitting like sets of 5 at RPE 6 and the weight they were using was going up at a faster rate or something like that?
Yeah, so I typically don't go that low RPE, but and if I'm going to go really low percentage, then there will be a benchmark somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So maybe they'll do a set of 5 at a 9 RPE, but that's one set and the bulk of their work is 70% or something like that. So we can benchmark the performance off of the harder set, but the bulk of the work is done somewhere else, the easier set. That may be one tactic that you would use.
Okay.
So that benchmark set is kind of what allows us to gauge the progress with a relative degree of accuracy.
I was having a hard time picturing like where's the thermometer in this system.
Yeah.
So I think my reservations are primarily practical. Conceptually, I like the idea, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Practically, each one of these developmental blocks is, what, like 5 to 8 weeks or something like that?
On average, yeah.
So let's just say the only variables we're dealing with are volume, RPE, frequency, and exercise selection. And within each of those variables, there's 4 or 5 levels of them that you could test, all independently, which would be, like hundreds or thousands of possibilities.
Yeah.
So, like, obviously, you're not testing all of those,
Right.
Because you'd have to work with the lifter for centuries. So, like, just kind of practically, how do you know that you have hit on something that is the best for that lifter? Or do you just kind of go until you find something that works and assume that's good enough?
I don't think you can know. I think you know that it's better than anything you've tried so far.
Fair.
So I have I would call it a balance between like exploring development cycles and focused development cycles. So if we're training for a major comp, then it's focus. It's something that we have good reason to believe this should work. But if we're further away, hey, let's explore a little bit. We think this will work. Hey, this seems fun. Let's try it and see what your reaction is. And you can use, I think you can use past experience to inform some of that. So, let's say you tried triples and that wasn't so good, and then you tried 5s and that was a bit better. Well, maybe try 8s, and is it better still, and does it keep pushing you in that direction?
Do results get better than 5s?
That's the pinnacle, actually.
I believe it's pronounced fads.
Indeed.
Okay, so...
But before you move on, you hit on a thing that I think is it's a weakness in this system, but it's a weakness in all systems. That there's a hard problem of data here. That you collect data, and no matter how much data you collect, it's got a shelf life.
Yeah.
Because the lifter that you are now is not the same lifter you were 2 years ago. So how valid are those trials?
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to ask
Yeah.
next. So like when you're planning for a meet and you want to run the best developmental cycle right before the meet, like how recent does that developmental cycle have to be?
Good question. I mean, the more so say you run development cycle X and get a good result. Well, the more you run development cycle X, the less true that's going to be because you start to acclimate to that stimulus. But then if you never use it, then it's still going to you're still going to expire at some point.
Yeah.
You know, so it's difficult to manage, and I think that's kind of the give and take that you have to work with to try to manage that. But the analogy that I came up with, I don't know if it's a good one or not, but I think finding the ideal individualized plan is like trying to find your way through a cave in the dark. And something like this, a tool like this, doesn't light up the whole cave because there's things that you just can't trial the variables. So it's a little pin light, you know, and you can maybe see a few things around you. The other problem is the rocks in the cave move around from time to time, you know, like we're saying that you're not the same athlete that you were. So it doesn't solve the whole problem of perfectly individualizing a plan, but I would rather have a pin light than no light at all. Which, to be fair, that's kind of, maybe that's where I was before doing this, but I don't think that's where you guys are.
Right.
You know, I think that was kind of a false assumption that I had when I was first doing this. I'm like, does nobody else see this? You know, but you guys have, and you've got a different approach to it, that you're not changing variables as drastically as maybe I was, or maybe a lot of other coaches are, within the training block. So you do get a better sense of what an athlete's response to a given stimulus is. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, so I think on that specific point of what your preconceptions were going into it, I think that's important to give some context around it. So for one, when you got into the game, the West Side approach was big.
Yeah.
And I would, to try not to put them down too much, I think the average person who saw themselves as a West Side practitioner would use what I would describe as randomization and call it variation. So that they were changing things so frequently and so significantly and without any kind of orderly fashion to it, on average, not everybody, that they were inherently not able to see the forest for the trees. And they didn't even have that pen light. Likewise, I think it's also important to point out that you work with a ton of extremely high-level athletes. So in that case, the question of good, better, and best is actually, those become much more narrow. So for example, if Bryce Lewis improves his total at all, I'm actually pretty confident we're close to optimal. Because he, just seeing progress at that point, is very near it. So I think those two things will probably help someone understand how you landed on this and why it's working well for your athletes. Because if they're improving at all, it's close enough to optimal for it not to matter the distinction between it and what might be better. On that same topic of preconceptions and potential biases that someone has coming to the table, I think the biggest weakness to it that I see is that there are baked-in biases and that you can only observe the ways of modifying training that you would modify. And I guess I just want to open that up broadly. Like, how far are you willing to step outside of the Mike T bubble to observe new things to know how close you could be getting?
Maybe I can answer what I think you're asking, and then you can tell me if I'm close.
Cool.
All right. I like to collect different strategies. So like I have my way of doing things, and we talked at the conference today about, you know, I often include assistance and supplemental exercises in different categories. But I also like to understand how somebody like you would program things and see what those differences are, or I've, you know, I look into different camps and see, like, well, what situation might I use this in? And because you can build a strategy around any of that. Like, you could build a strategy around just comp lift only if you wanted to do that. Or like, I don't think that like the emerging strategy concept is a framework,
Right.
and I really don't. There's only a few limitations that you would have. Like you can even include variation within that as long as it was a pattern that repeated with some regularity. Now, if it's a 10-week long pattern, then you never really, that's too much to be manageable, you know.
Right.
But you know, if you had a alternating weeks, you can do that, and we do that with some athletes. Some athletes have a great response to that type of thing, but that's, you know, kind of veering off topic maybe, but that's not the default of
Yep.
where we start usually, you know.
Yep.
Is that even close?
So like to kind of use an extreme example, if you notice that one of your lifters just responded really well to high intensity work, do you think you'd ever find yourself at the Bulgarian system? Like if I understood Eric correctly, like it seemed like he was asking like not
Like
necessarily
you just follow the data.
Yeah, like not necessarily just what variables are you willing to touch, but more like how far out of the sphere of what you typically do would you be willing to venture?
I think you could end up at the Bulgarian system. Now, whether let's take a theoretical athlete that we can look at our crystal ball and say that is the best way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm a good enough coach to follow, to get to that answer,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
you know? But that's the other thing that I see as maybe a potential weakness to it, but I'm not even so sure that it's a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
It really emphasizes coaching skill. And I think that's a thing that doesn't get talked about enough, that there is absolutely a skill component to being a good coach. And some coaches are good at it and some aren't. And some people just have a knack for it and some people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about just the program, you know. Now, yeah, and I don't know if my skill is enough that I can get that far out of what I would normally do.
Mm-hmm.
But in theory, you could.
So that makes a lot of sense to me. So what you're saying is the emerging strategy, for lack of a better word.
Framework.
Framework,
Yeah.
thank you, is a framework that any coach could use,
Yes.
given the data set, given the analytical tools you have, and that it could be shittier or less shitty depending on how
100%.
much you pay attention and how wide of a net you're willing to cast,
Mm-hmm.
and how appropriately you're willing to cast that net. So even if that is a weakness of the system, it's not a different weakness than any other style of programming.
Well, that's the thing I keep coming back to, and like we started talking about weaknesses in the system. The ones that I've found, I'm like, yeah, that's a weakness to the system, but I don't see how that's a weakness that doesn't exist in other systems.
Right.
It's just that
It's fair.
I think it tries to meet it head on, you know.
So here's one thing I'm considering is that any system that uses this probably needs to employ autoregulation or some way of allowing for change in load week to week, because that's the key thing that's changing.
Well, you could. So as Bondarchuk coached throwers and had people lifting, he used a fixed load approach. And the idea was, well, as you got stronger during the course of the development cycle, you would lift faster. you
Okay.
know?
Okay.
So you could do that. I haven't dabbled in that.
Sure.
Yeah, so you just need something to gauge the temperature, like you said, Bryce.
Yeah.
So you could have velocity of a fixed load. You could have an AMRAP
Yeah.
on a fixed load, or you could have an estimated 1RM based on RPE like you do.
Right. And I'm aware of some people who've tried this with AMRAPs and found it to be successful. Like, I thought that, well, you're going to get different reps, and so that's kind of a different stimulus. I don't know if that's going to work, and they said it seems to work just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively small portion of the stimulus. You
Right.
know? I mean, it is more than a single at 8 RPE,
Yeah.
but it certainly wouldn't be the bulk of it. So I would think it would be a reasonable temperature gauge.
Right.
One thing I think is like there's a range, a probably wide range and maybe narrow as an athlete gets more developed and more elite, but there's a probably wide range of programs, period, like plural, that an athlete can respond really well to. And if an athlete is making progress, we're probably not going to be searching the field too wide for what can be making more progress.
Yeah.
Athletes making progress, fantastic. But that's true of any system, really. That's
Yeah.
not like an emergent strategies thing.
Well, I would like to, I think that would be an interesting thing to know at some point is, like, for a given, say, Wilks score, what's a what's a reasonable rate of gain for that person, you know, just on the average. And of course, that gets individualized too. Some people are
Born with the 460 Wilks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
well, and then get stronger rapidly, and then
Mhm.
some people just don't.
Yep.
So
I can send you a data set if you want to look into that.
yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah, like you can just go on Open Powerlifting, download everything, filter based on the criteria you want. So like, you know, maybe only drug tested feds or like only IPF affiliates, and then sort alphabetically. See how many people show up in the database multiple times, and then calculate rates of progress.
Yeah.
And you can see kind of at various levels of strength how that changes.
Yeah, I think that would be cool to know that, you know.
So one potential limitation of this strategy that I think may be not necessarily unique to it, but maybe isn't present in more common strategies, is I'm not entirely sure how you'd account for second order effects. So let's say you run a developmental cycle, it's a type 3 response, doesn't look like it's going all that well. Run a pivot block, go to another developmental cycle, it's a type 1 response, looks like it's awesome. Very potentially, something in that first developmental cycle could have potentiated the second one.
Yeah.
And now you've got periodization.
Yeah. And it, like, I think if you're using like a block periodization paradigm, and you have like, you know, like volume blocks and intensity blocks, and you see like, oh, if I run an intensity block after a volume block, it does really well. But if I run 2 intensity blocks back to back, the second one doesn't do that great. So it seems like the volume block is potentiating the intensity block. If you have like a decent number of developmental cycles in the mix, how would you be able to tease that out without not just running a fair amount of developmental cycles, but running the same one like 3 or 4 times?
Well, kind of the reason that I started calling this emerging strategies was because it starts with small. You know, you start with the microcycle. Let's figure out the volumes, intensities, and so on that you respond well to. But in theory, you should be able to go up from there. Once we've got that sorted, we should be able to figure out the next level and the next level, and eventually, you know, a long-term plan that is optimized to an individual. Now, that's not going to happen because by the time you figure that out, it's the Theseus's ship problem, you know.
Yeah.
But I think, also what's going on to figure any of this out with any sort of degree of certainty, because there's no control group or anything like that going on. So you're taking a Bayesian approach to your certainty levels. You know, you try once and floor presses look like they did awesome. Well, that's one time, you know. So the next trial, like, I don't know, that one didn't go so well. So it's like the more data points that you get on floor press, the more certain you can be of it. But again, hopefully once you've kind of established that smaller cycle, then you can start to figure out how the sequences fit together. But it is a lot more difficult to move up a level. You know, it's relatively easy, I think, to figure out what's going on at that first level. But to move up a level and figure out the ideal sequence of blocks. And there's other things that are kind of counterintuitive that I would place in that second level as well. And they're not coming to mind right now, which is convenient. But
It's been a long day.
things like template changes and stuff like that, like that's really at that second level as well. Because if you change the template but you're using a bunch of exercises and intensities that aren't going to produce results for you, then you're probably not going to see anything anyway, you know. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a limitation to it, that you're not going to get kind of that mid or long-term plan that's like perfectly figured out. I mean, can you get that anyway? Like maybe on the average, but I don't think that there's a rejection of exercise science in it. You know, that what we learn from exercise science informs, like fills in those gaps that we don't know from individualized data yet. And I think that makes it a really reasonable place to start most of the time.
So one of the things, like I think the approach does well, and maybe even one of the reasons to think about it in the first place is like, you know, look, we don't want the Soviet model, we don't want a long-term model, we don't even, like, why assume that a 4-week / deload, or 4 week followed by deload, followed by 4 week, followed by deload with increased intensity works for everyone? It might be a good place to start, but why would we assume that in the first place? So let's start with kind of first basic principles. I really like that idea, but at some point we have to put down on paper what we think the athlete is going to be doing in the gym. I'm telling them what to do in the gym. We have to tell them, okay, how often do I want you to squat, to bench, to deadlift? So like, what is this basic building block that we're starting off with? And you've chosen the microcycle or the week, but even within that, you've decided based on some intuition or athlete history or your experience working with the athlete. Okay, I think the athlete is going to squat, bench, and deadlift X, Y, and Z times, and I think this selection of exercises works best with them. So that's kind of where first basic principle steps off, and coach comes in and says, this is the plan for now until we have better information.
Yeah. And I think that's a great spot where, you know, we can say, well, you know, the data shows that, you know, this frequency works best, or you know, for most people most of the time, and you know, I've done a little dabbling with some other things like 80% rep tests and stuff like that to try to get a little bit better starting point, you know. But it was interesting to me to look at that type of data and see how many exceptions there are, you know. Like, yeah, there's an overall trend, but there's so many exceptions. You know, you may just be one of those exceptions, you know. But I guess it's
I think a lot more people are exceptions than realize. Like
on the whole, right?
Yeah,
nobody's average at everything.
Yeah, like I think people underestimate just variability. Period. Like if there's something that works best on average, you know, I think a lot of people interpret that as this is the best thing for 90% of people, whereas it might be the best thing for 30% of people and works well enough for the other 70% that they don't drag down the average.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
and I think that I think the difference and any critique or hesitation I have around your system is not actually the system, but it's actually the starting point, which is not an issue with the framework. Now, the more I think about it, if you're starting with the pen light somewhere closer to the mouth of the cave, I think I'm just comfortable and more confident starting somewhere that I think would be a little bit better for most people. Like I might have a volume and then a intensification block with some form of undulation and a little slightly different exercise selection, because through my personal coaching history, I've seen that it hits the vast majority of people, and then from there I adjust, because I'm trying to think back through my own coaching career, and something that falls in that range seems to work for, at least in my experience, like 90% of people.
Yeah, I think so the reason I asked about second order effects is I think that our general approach isn't all that different. But I start with a framework that seems to capture those second order effects on average for most people, and then kind of work back and kind of work on fixing the first level stuff from there.
Well, let me kind of turn a question around that you guys asked me. So one thing that I've done no more than a handful of times now is I end up finding one of these athletes that doesn't respond so well to high intensity, the classic powerlifting peaking thing, and responds much better to lower intensity. So we'll go into the meet with those low intensity blocks, and it seems to work well. in the frameworks that you guys use,
Mm-hmm.
can you arrive at that conclusion?
I think so. So the way I tend to set things up is I'll have 3 very similar 4 to 6 week blocks, but the first block's a little lighter, second block's a little heavier, third block's a little heavier, and just basically see how squat, bench, and deadlift responds for that lifter in each of those 3 blocks. And so, like, let's say deadlift does really good with lower intensity, bench does better with middle intensities, squat does better with higher intensities. Then from there, what I tend to do is like just build kind of a 6-week block of training that's going to have lower intensity deadlifts, moderate intensity bench, higher intensity squats, some variation in there, but that's kind of where that like block lives, and then just run it back to back to back to back to back for a long time. And still like iterating from there, but kind of having a framework I work with on the front end, and then once I run through that test, kind of using the data from that test to optimize for that lifter.
It's funny because it sounds like, I have this framework and I'm like, man, can you guys believe this? This is so cool. And you're like, yeah, I've been doing that.
Well, I mean, we all have systems for like parsing data and trying to figure out what's best for the athlete. Like I was thinking, one way I arrived at is similar to what Greg said, is starting off with a lighter block, and if you find that like the weights are getting heavier week to week, and the athlete is reporting lower and lower lasted RPEs, like this is a great training response. So you kind of just couch that in the back of your head and be like, okay, that's cool. Let's go on with things as normal, and then if things start to get worse over time, you notice, all right, well, things are getting worse over time, and it's note taking, but just in a different way that you said. But real quick before I pass it on, I'm trying to think like, okay, where can I meet Mike, and where's the similarity between what we're doing? And I'm thinking like, if I have a 4-week version of an emerging strategies thing, like that's perfect for me. I get 4 weeks of periodization. I can test out a strategy for kind of an extended period of time. So like, I realize like that's where I'm comfortable. It's kind of like basically just a slightly more periodized version of what you're already doing. So do a 4-week thing, see how things go over that period of time, evaluate what things are like, then decide, okay, what are the broad brushstrokes of what I want to change and stuff like that.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback, I think back in 2013 or 14, I sat down and I wrote 10 programs of different levels of volume. Jokingly, we call them Helms Co. Of basically different relative volume loads of the big 3 with kind of 8-week blocks, essentially. And that was basically the framework for what became my training system. And the cool thing about having Bryce here is that Bryce not only have I got to work with him since 2010, but he's got to work with me since 2010. And he remembers back to when I just told him to do Shaiko to be modified way back in the day, to then when I started giving him West Side-ish inspired things I actually wrote, to then having RTS inspired RPE training, to then probably for the last 4 or 5 years, basically playing his greatest hits, much like you do, but coming out of those 8-week Helms Co. templates that I wrote, that I then use in the same way you guys are talking about, to go like moving them up or down that ladder and seeing what works better, and then obviously making a lot of other individual adjustments. So it is less systematic than what you're doing, just because I know I don't use the same tools as you, and I think I would like to think I make up for that by starting somewhere further down the cave, but that's completely based on my assumptions and where I've been before.
Well, there's something that you've said a number of times today, and you said it just in this conversation, paying attention.
Yep.
And something that you talked about earlier today was, how do you know when you're actually paying attention? But that's what this comes back to me, is like, this is a framework that facilitates paying attention. And it sounds like you guys all have frameworks for paying attention, and how do you figure this out? Like, well, you look and you use your head and you figure it out, It sounds like that's kind of the central theme maybe, and you mentioned John Kiley during your talk today, and that's one of the big things that I've taken from listening to him is that paying attention is more important than any of the planning that goes into it.
Yeah, absolutely. The plan is the one that adapts to the athlete.
Yeah.
For sure.
So I thought this would be cool to do because Mike has been gracious enough to expose himself to our potential criticisms. I think it's much easier to criticize something's blind spots than to potentially be constructive and figure out how it could be improved. So I'll put it to myself as well, so I don't just get to be the moderator who always looks smart, or at least isn't exposed to criticism. Bryce and Greg, can you guys think of any ways which, even if we don't know whether we have the technology to support it, because it sounds like you can do some cool shit, are there ways that you see to improve upon what Mike's doing?
I think so. So, I am very much on board with almost everything you do, except for the lack of peaking. That's the part I find the most counterintuitive, and that's also the part that seems to be the most testable within your framework. And I think that's also kind of the most obvious second order effect that you could potentially tack on for added benefits. So like if there's a developmental block that is consistently working well for a lifter, you could, rather than running a pivot block after it, try out different peaking ideas to see if you can like get a further elevation above that. And that strikes me, and I could be totally full of shit, and you could be totally right, that peaking doesn't accomplish anything, and if you time the meet to where they reach their peak form within a developmental block that's as good as they're going to get, I just don't think that's right though. I think there is something to peaking, and I think that peaking is something that would naturally fit into your system. That would be kind of a small enough kind of addendum to a block that already works well that it would be testable.
Yeah, and totally agree. I think that the non-peaking way of doing it, so the idea is just, if you know that your time to peak in a training block is 6 weeks, then you put the meet on the 6th week and you work backwards from there, and that's how you figure out the start, and you rest 2 or 3 days prior and don't really do much taper. You train normally up to that point. But you're right that's a reasonable place to start if you don't know anything else about them, because I think the peaking or the traditional tapering lends itself to more noise in the system, especially early on, when you maybe don't know that much about the athlete. But you're absolutely right that that's something that's pretty easily testable and potentially beneficial. And if you can figure out what exercises they're going to respond best to in a development cycle, there's no reason you can't figure out what type of taper strategy would work well.
To that point, by the way, have you found that time to peak is like a durable quality for fives as it is for singles?
Yeah.
So like that's just kind of like a quality that exists for athletes. Like whether I have singles at 8 or sets of 5 at 8, it's kind of a similar time before we start seeing a drop off in performance.
It seems to be, which is kind of weird.
It's kooky.
You know, there does seem to be a small range, right? So for me, my time to peak is around 6 exposures. It might be 5, it might be 7, but it doesn't seem to be tied to anything in particular.
I don't think that's all too kooky when I think about it, given our metric for what performance is always the same. We're trying to look at basically our estimated 1RM. We're kind of looking at the same quality each time. And if we accept some of the conceptual models like fitness fatigue and things like that, I would think that kind of makes sense to me. Like, we're doing enough to produce overload, which means we're also producing some kind of fatigue. We're trying to get the same outcome each time, so you would think we'd have a roughly similar time to, at least in a stable person's life, right? All else being equal, we should see that. So I think that makes sense, and I think that's actually kind of cool. And I also actually had the same exact thought as Greg. Like, that was also one of the things, I think I brought that up to you.
You did.
Last year. I was like, look, man, tapers work, okay? You know, like,
Well,
yeah.
to be honest, like that conversation from last year has stuck out in my head the whole year.
Yeah.
And there have been multiple times when I have an athlete that's coming into a competition, and if things don't look like they're progressing just how they normally would, you know, and you're just going to cruise right into this peak, then we'll implement a taper strategy to try to help it along.
Sure.
And like I mentioned in the talk yesterday, that the additional stress, the additional weight manipulation, everything that goes into a competition block, it seems like 50-50. You know, sometimes athletes seem to handle it and cruise right in. Other times they need it. You know, and then you have some athletes that just recover pretty poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, I feel like it just makes sense. You know,
Yep.
but absolutely, it's something that's testable.
Yep. Yeah. Do you have anything else, Bryce, on that point?
I was trying to think off like what's my checklist of what's important in training. Like you have periodization. It's just it happens when you switch to a pivot or when you switch to a peaking block or something like that, or when you switch from one development cycle that looks like XYZ to another one. That's periodization in the same way that someone would have an 8-week block and a different 8-week block down the line.
Yeah.
Which kind of takes care of some of the variation in strain, because there's some variation as the year goes on. Plus, I think the research on periodization was like a small effect size, like it's not massive anyways.
Depends how you slice it.
On elite athletes, I think it was bigger.
There's no research on the athletes.
People who are not untrained.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's an accurate way to describe it.
Sure. We've got a metric to assess if an athlete's getting better. We have a coach who hopefully has a system of being able to see when that's happening. Responsive athletes as well. Like, and this is something that conceivably you could apply to any training approach. So I think I'm more on the same page with you than I thought I was like a month ago or even a few weeks ago as well, after like kind of seeing like, what are the pieces actually here.
Well, I think also I bear some responsibility, like you guys were talking about bristling at the idea in the beginning. I bear some responsibility for that because the way I couched it in the beginning is kind of this anti-periodization.
Periodization is dead.
Right.
My name is Mike T. And I'm going to kill it.
And it's not that, right? And the more I think about it, the more, like, yeah, there are limitations to it, but and that's maybe a reason to go toward a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach, but it's still planning training. It's just from a different vantage point. And I think maybe my reasons for going this direction are more epistemological rather than anti-periodization, which that's where I tried to focus, and I think I'll continue to try to focus now. Is just, to me, it's more about how do I know what I think I know,
Right.
and can I really support what I think?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a decent place to finish. I want to really thank you for taking the time and exposing yourself to criticism. I think that's an admirable quality, and I think we're probably all better for it. I know I've learned a lot this weekend, and it's always just fun to talk about this stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, and if this is on YouTube, I know that at least 90% of you have already left. So for the 10% of you who are here, you win. Thank you for staying around, and I will see you next time on AO.
Reactive Training Systems.